And next up to continue, we have Michael from Salt Security. Hello, Michael.
Hi, Janica. How are you?
Yeah, so you have a great talk title. So it says the Real World API Security Edition, when best practices stop being polite and start being real. So I'm going to let you go straight into it. So please, if you start with a brief introduction of who you are, and then I'll meet you back here on stage in about 20 minutes.
Absolutely. Thanks, Janica. Yes, I am Mike Isbitski, technical evangelist with Salt Security. We're going to be talking through some best practices. We actually have a much more exhaustive list of them, as many vendors in the space do have these. These have actually been put together based on customer experiences. Also, a lot of my analyst experience. So we'll talk through a little bit of that as we get through it. We also have some customer case studies. But as Janica pointed out, this is real world. That's kind of how we themed it. If anybody's not familiar with that show, because it was kind of a American pop culture reference, it was essentially a reality TV show where they put different types of people from different walks of life into one room. And then kind of reality ensued, right? They had to work, they had different personalities, and oftentimes there was a lot of strife, and it's reality, right? So when we talk about best practices, sometimes there's kind of utopia of what things could be or should be, and reality or practice is something much different. So with that, let's kind of dig in here. We've seen this, right? This is kind of the theme of the conference. APIs are software, right? And software is eating the world. Very famous quote from Mark Andreessen. I'd imagine everybody here at API Days is very familiar with APIs. If not, just know they are kind of fundamental to everything, every app and every system we engineer. API security prediction. So this is interesting. This is actually taken from LinkedIn. Michelle McLean is our VP of marketing at Salt Security. And she was having this conversation with Mark O'Neill, who's a Gartner analyst. Many of the vendors in our space are using this Gartner prediction. It's very accurate, right? By 2022, API abuses will move from an infrequent to the most frequent attack vector. There's been no shortage of incidents, right? They're typically daily or weekly at this point, and many different types of events, right? Not just data breaches, but also things like data exposures or leaky APIs, right? That are privacy impacting. You can see Mark O'Neill kind of acknowledged that, yeah, this was really accurate, right? And it's played out. And I actually used to work with Mark O'Neill. I was a former Gartner analyst. So yeah, they're very proud of this, right? It's true, right? So we're almost in 2022. We got a few more weeks. We're here, right? So I'll be eager to see what the next strategic planning assumption is from former Gartner colleagues. But this is reality, right? We're dealing with a lot of API attacks. Three areas of best practice that I'm going to cover today, and I am going to go through this quickly because I do want to save time for questions and answers. And if I don't get to anything, please do reach out after this session as well. The first is API documentation, discovery, and cataloging, right? You hear this frequently. We have to document all APIs. We should be cataloging or inventorying them. Typically what happens though is there's so many APIs, particularly as an organization gets into things like microservices architecture or cloud native design patterns, right? Most things are API enabled or API first. So you end up with a lot of outer and inner APIs, right? So maintaining that catalog is much more difficult than just tapping your API management suite and pulling the list of APIs. The first best practice really is use machine formats, right? If you're documenting APIs, and hopefully you are, don't be using Word documentation or Visio flowcharts, right? That they might be useful to us as humans, whether we're in security or non-security roles, to understand how does this API work. But really, the building blocks of how APIs are integrated and benefits to other elements of the lifecycle of APIs, those documents should be in machine formats. These days, that's often Open API Specification or OAS. For REST APIs, that was Swagger, right, in the older version, but there are other formats, right, like API Blueprint or RAML. GraphQL has its own format. The takeaway is use machine formats, right, because these things are machine usable, right, and we could use them in testing, we could use them in protection mechanisms. The downside, though, with schemas is there's gaps, right? You don't have to document everything in a schema, and it's also still kind of a manual process, right? So we should be doing or documenting our APIs with machine formats. It doesn't often happen, right? Because it does take time. At best, we might have that at launch, and then things kind of drift from there. So your production API traffic, even sometimes non-production, right? You have different pre-prod environments, that can look very different from the documented or intended design. Tag and label APIs and microservices consistently. This is actually one that's front and center for developers and DevOps engineers. But if you can get in the practice of tagging and labeling assets, APIs, and containers, typically, right? It creates kind of a virtuous cycle, right? Just like those machine formats for schema definitions are very powerful. So too are tags and labels. And this actually comes back into play when you start thinking about a few things, right? When you think about integrity of software supply chains, we've heard some of that with the cybersecurity executive order here in the United States. But digital supply chains are kind of problematic, right? Most of us are working with third parties, and it gets incredibly complex very quickly, right? And they might not be documenting things fully. It's also very useful to security operations and SecOps analysts, right? So your SOC may not be familiar with how your APIs are coded or integrated. They're not going to understand call sequences, but tags and labels can kind of help them trace back what's going on, what is the owning container, and who is the responsible party for that. It's also useful for compliance activity, right? If you have governance, risk, and compliance teams in your organization, they are starting to get more tuned in to CI/CD build pipelines because they can become a very good system of record, right? Much more so than collecting emails or static documents, right? That data gets very stale quickly. Customer example of pitfalls related to lack of API inventory. Trip Actions is a SOL customer. There's actually some case studies on our website. There's a lot of information here, and I do have to move quickly. But Trip Actions is a business travel management vendor, and they're having a lot of issues with maintaining inventory, right? Just like I've been describing. Um, they needed a way to discover all their APIs automatically and continuously, right? It can't just be uh, at version one of a launch of an API. It has to be something that's continuous because APIs change, right? We're changing contracts, we're changing the underlying code, might be working with other partners. So that landscape changes very quickly. All right, runtime protection. This one's very prominent, right? If you talk to an API gateway vendor or API management vendor, they will tout their threat protection capabilities, they'll often call them. They're essentially message filters, right? Because API gateways can do message translation, right? And enforcement of authentication tokens, token translation, like those types of things, right? So they have the ability to inspect API calls or messages, and then also do transformations on them or translations. So inherently, most gateway vendors have these threat protection capabilities, but they are essentially very lightweight threat protection filters, like something you would find in a web application firewall or WAF. Just often not as well maintained, unfortunately. Right when organizations buy into a WAF appliance or WAF service, they're also buying into managed rule sets, right? Can the vendor provide me tuned message filters or rules for my specific apps and APIs? The world of API gateways and API management is a little rougher, right? Those filters aren't often maintained. It's often on you to tune those message filters appropriately. Because out of the box, it's typically some basic known malicious character sets that might be used in injection attacks. Even if you enable them though, just know it's really only useful for injection, maybe JSON injection, XML injection, enforcement of HTTPS, those types of things. It still leaves gaps in your API protection. The other problem is that you can very quickly overload your API gateways, right? Because they are essentially proxies. And performance and latency with APIs is often a problem, right? Particularly if you're getting into microservices architectures. Now your app can be non-performant, right? And now that means lost customers or employees just can't get to things. And that last point, I've been kind of talking about it, right? The maintenance of the rules and signatures, it's kind of WAFs, but even worse. In some cases, the API gateway vendors have actually repurposed open source WAFs like mod security. You'll sometimes see that. And mod security rule maintenance is actually not not a simple matter, even for somebody that is a security subject matter expert. Um, Rate limiting and traffic management. Every API gateway offers this, as do all network load balancers and application delivery controllers, because they are proxies, right? Like I was saying, every API gateway is a proxy, usually reverse, but also sometimes forward, right? So inbound or outbound, hopefully both, right? Because we do need to be concerned about both in API call flows. Um, Rate limiting mechanisms can be useful, but really, if your partners or suppliers are a known quantity, right? Maybe if you have single digit partners and suppliers, fixed IP address space, you know what their API consumption should look like, rate limits can work. The problem is when you're creating public or open APIs or externally facing APIs, things that need to be consumed by customers or employees on the internet, it becomes very problematic, right? Because they're moving, right? Everybody these days is typically on a mobile device in addition to their desktop. So IP address space changes frequently, and attackers also shift through IP address spaces pretty easily. They also leverage cloud compute to launch attacks. We see geo-distributed attacks very frequently with some Salt customers. Um, Quota and use limits, they're certainly present. They can be somewhat useful for security use cases, but really it's a non-security control. It's useful for monetizing your APIs or productizing them. So yeah, again, API gateway and API management vendors will often push this as a security control. It can be, right? Just know that there's nuances there. And as you scale and operationalize your APIs, typically rate limits and IP address allow and deny lists fall over pretty quickly. They are hard to maintain. Another customer example, Finastra, who is actually a fintech provider. I'm gonna zone in on kind of their core use case because we're kind of time bound today. Their security use case was that they needed to identify attackers that were using very advanced techniques to evade rate limits, right, and other protections. Just like I've been describing, in their case, they were seeing attackers move globally, essentially, but spinning up new instances in different areas of the world. All the rate limits just weren't working, right? So they needed something more to kind of keep ahead of it. Their security teams were just tearing their hair out trying to institute rate limits and block lists to stop these persistent attackers. And actually, it was some form of credential stuffing as well, because a lot of organizations in the fintech sector are very concerned about things like account takeover, right? So, not necessarily something that exists within the OWASP API security top 10. It's kind of alluded to when you dig into things like broken authentication, but it's very tricky to kind of do these things at scale. And Finastra was doing all the right things for DevOps and DevSecOps, and still they recognized they had an issue. And the last area of best practice for today is API-centric security operations or SecOps, right? What do we do with all of this information? The first is when you're approaching like what API telemetry do I gather, you do have to give some thought to recognizing all of the uh, security and non-security teams in your organization, right? And the workflows they're or work streams they're working within. If you start gathering too much telemetry and you don't have a good mechanism to kind of pick that apart and identify useful signals, it very quickly overwhelms all teams, right, in IT, and then everybody's kind of miserable. Um, the personas are different, right? If you think about if I am a developer creating an API, I'm very concerned about code level issues because those are the things I own. If there's a problem with a load balancer or an API gateway, I would want to offload that to an operations team or infrastructure and operations. Maybe network security, right? It varies per organization. And if it's kind of nebulous, maybe I need to engage my application security team to kind of triage further and identify who is an appropriate owner for this and what isn't an appropriate mitigation, right? So just collecting, AWS CloudTrail logs or whatever your cloud provider is. Maybe you're deploying OpenShift clusters. You start to gather a lot of log data, and you can overwhelm the systems that gather them. But then, what do you do with it, right? So it's kind of an age-old security problem. It just gets much worse in the world of API security. The other thing to recognize is that within IT, there's typically multiple systems that employees work within. So when you're considering digital forensics and incident response, you have to kind of bear that in mind, right? What are all these systems that employees work with day to day? Because you don't want to be disruptive to what are your developers working on? What are the I&O teams supporting? And what fires are they putting out that day? Maybe they're dealing with phishing or ransomware attack. Um, the last practice I'll be talking about today is kind of related to what I was just describing, although going a step further, right, and recognizing that security teams or SecOps teams, right, going back to the Security Operations Center analyst or SOC analyst, they're already dealing with a high level of fatigue, right, because security issues aren't stopping. There's many forms of security events and incidents. API attacks are just one, right? So a SecOps team has to deal with everything, right? And they probably don't have the subject matter expertise for all areas of technology, which is again why those work streams and workflows are incredibly important, right? If it is an API issue, I likely need to engage the developer for that API or third party. Um, SecOps teams very often work within SIM and source solutions to gather all those logs, identify the useful signals, and then automate incident response. So it's very important to remember, when you gather the logs, think about how am I kind of feeding that data into their SIM and source solution so it's actually useful and actionable. Often, what we see, and I saw this very frequently as a Gartner analyst, was SIM teams were overloaded just in the space of application security. They didn't even know what application logs to gather, let alone APIs. And again, they just don't live in that world. They don't understand application context frequently or API context. So it was very often a conversation of how many feeds should I gather. But likely there was too many, right? Because it was decided there was a good idea to gather everything, and then back off from that. So a lot of SOC modernization efforts are to pare down how much data you're gathering and making sure you're gathering the right things to actually gather useful signals. So you can kind of think of it as improving signal to noise ratio and reducing false positives, right? You don't want to alert on every possible API related issue unless it's clearly an attack or potentially abusable API. And the last customer example for today is AppsFlyer, which is a mobile marketing, analytics, and attribution vendor. And tied to this, right, back to that SecOps story, is they needed a way to kind of work efficiently with their SOCs or their SOC analysts. How are they handling SecOps, right? They knew that their APIs were likely being probed and attacked. Attackers very frequently do reconnaissance. It can be passive or low and slow. And then, they wanted to identify that and then actually stitch together the events, right? What is the API call sequence, or in SecOps language, that's typically attacker timeline or the attack chain. So how do we do things at Salt? Very quickly, I'll kind of describe how the platform works. If you are interested in a tech demo, please do reach out. Um, The basis of everything is traffic collection, right? And logs and configuration, because we have many different moving pieces of an architecture that power APIs. Depending on your environment, that could be different things like traditional load balancers or delivery controllers. Maybe it's F5 or Nginx. But maybe you're in the world of Kubernetes and microservices, so you have much more. That's a lot of data, right? So you need machine learning and AI to analyze all of that. Not to mention you need kind of cloud scale storage to hold everything, right? Logs can very quickly grow in size. Collectively at Salt, we call that our context-based API analysis architecture. This is patented, and that feeds the Salt Security API Protection Platform. There's three use cases. The first is really API discovery, right? We talked about how knowing all of your APIs is a problem, right? But also data exposure points is a big problem, particularly when you consider privacy. Uh, Identify and stop attacks, right? All the things in OWASP top 10, but more, right? We talked about credential stuffing is something that doesn't exist in the top 10, but is something most organizations do need to be concerned with. And help improve API security posture over time. You could call this vulnerability management, you can call it configuration assessment, but identify all those things and then apply machine assistance to that, right? And route that to the right person. What is the appropriate piece of information for this persona in the organization? And I'm going to wrap up because I want to save time for Q&A. But there's a lot of resources we have available. Most of the time I spend at Salt is actually creating content to help raise awareness around API security issues. Uh, Always open to feedback, so please do take a look and let me know through your preferred medium. Uh, Salt also puts together threat research reports. We have an entity called Salt Labs. You'll see two reports there. BOLA is actually prominent in both, as is broken authentication. And actually, we just released, I believe, the third report today. So certainly take a look. And thank you, everybody, for attending. And we'll stop there. Janica, if we have questions.
Yes, excuse me. Thank you. Great. That was really, really good. Always super interesting to hear sort of real life use cases. And it looks like it did strike a chord. So somebody during the first half of your speak or talk said, adjusting schemas really is annoying sometimes. Comment from the audience. Can you relate? What would you say to that?
It is certainly. I mean, I guess it depends what your role is. Is it as a security practitioner dealing with the schemas changing because dev teams or engineering teams are changing things, or as a developer, do you have to adjust the schema? Because that's also kind of nightmarish, right? It's going to take away from some time. I would say that dev side tooling has gotten a little better, right? You can kind of mock and design APIs with things like Postman. Then there's usually plugins to IDs that can help you kind of semi-automate the schema generation. But is everybody doing that? Not always, right? And then once it's generated, is that actually being given to the ops teams and security teams? Usually, no, that's not the case.
Yeah. Yeah, someone says agree, but it's tough to convince the dev team to update the schema. So I think they would talk from that perspective. Well, the other thing, like you're really thinking about the real world and the realities of the work, which is there's never enough time, there's never enough resources, committing feature requests and everything. So on the note of prioritization, what would you say, in a situation where, how do you know what to do when you can't do everything? Do you have any sort of golden?
Yeah, I would say so. Some of that we address in the larger set of best practices. Typically what we see is organizations prioritized by what is internet facing or exposed to the larger internet, because that is it's an exposed attack surface or attack vector, and then they'll also prioritize those APIs that provide data or functionality that's bound by certain regulations, right? So if you're in scope for GDPR because you're doing business with European Union citizens, wherever they may be, right? It's not just in the EU. Then you'd likely prioritize those APIs. That's still hard to do, right? Unless you're doing the sensitive data identification, right? Often we see data security teams start to get concerned about APIs because they need to know all their data exposure points.
Mm.
I'd say historically what I saw though was things like PCI DSS, right? So if you're dealing with cardholder payments and payment processing, you would prioritize those APIs. Typically that infers externally facing or internet facing, but sometimes it's internal, right? It depends how you architect your environments. The other is like open banking efforts, PSD2, those types of things. So
Yeah. Good. Well, thank you. I hope that people are taking notes on what you're saying. I think we're going to wrap up here. So what is the best way for people to get in touch with you or Salt Security if they want to know more?
Yeah, it's on the slide here. So please, reach out to me. My address isn't anything too obfuscated here. First name, last initial at salt.security. Nicolau is actually our security engineer that was assisting me yesterday with our tech demo. But yeah, if you prefer email, by all means use that. But also LinkedIn, I check very frequently, or Twitter. I actually have a profile there. It's just not listed. So you'll find me. Yeah, I'm Mike Isbitski, former Gartner analyst, tech evangelist at Salt.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you.
Yep. Thank you. Take care, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the conference.